William the Conqueror, the bastard who made England. He died the way he had lived, alone with his rage, surrounded by men who feared him, in a country he had conquered but never really understood. On the morning of September 9th, 1087, in a hilltop priory outside Rouen, William, Duke of Normandy by inheritance, King of England by the sword, listened to the great bell of the cathedral tolling for prime, and commended his soul to the Virgin. He was 59. His belly, monstrously distended by years of drinking and hunting, was already beginning to burst the seams of his royal robes. Within hours his attendants would strip the corpse, flee with whatever they could carry, and leave him naked on the floor of the house where he had spent his last 5 weeks dying. Within weeks his body, crammed into a sarcophagus too short for it, would explode at the funeral, filling Saint Etienne of Caen with a stench no incense could mask. It was a grotesque end to the most consequential life in English history. 21 years earlier, on another Christmas morning, this same man, then a short-tempered duke of disputed legitimacy from a second-rank French duchy, had been crowned king in Westminster Abbey, while Norman soldiers, mistaking the cheers inside for a riot, set fire to the surrounding houses. The congregation had fled through smoke. Only the bishops remained at the altar, and William, for the only recorded moment of his life, was visibly trembling. Between that trembling coronation and that bursting corpse lies the creation of England, its language, its law, its landed elite, its castles, its relationship to Europe, the very DNA of its institutions. No figure in 1,000 years of English history looms larger, and almost everything about him, his birth, his survival, his victory at Hastings, his cold and brilliant administration of a kingdom he had stolen, was improbable to the point of miracle. He was born a bastard in a tanner's town, grew up watching his guardians murdered in his bedchamber, conquered a kingdom against the prevailing wind and with the Pope's banner at his saddle, built 500 castles, commissioned the most thorough administrative survey in medieval Europe, and died in such disgrace that a minor knight had to be bribed on the spot to let him be buried at all. This is his story. Chapter 1. A child of the cliff town. The cliff at Falaise rises like a grey tooth from the valley of the Ante. And on that cliff, in the autumn of 1028, or possibly late 1027, the chroniclers themselves never settled it. A girl named Heleva gave birth to a son fathered by the Duke. She was not his wife. She may never have been his mistress in any formal sense. The later romance that she rode through the castle gate on a white horse refusing the back entrance is almost certainly a fiction grafted on by minstrels who loved their heroines haughty. What the charters tell us is plainer and more interesting. Her father Fulbert was no peasant leather pounder, as the legend of William the Bastard would have it, but a man who appears in ducal documents as Cubicularius Ducis, the Duke's chamberlain. He was a burgher of Falaise with a foot inside the ducal household. The Tanner story, the one that would haunt William for the rest of his life, and drive him to one of his most terrifying acts of cruelty, originates in a single Latin word, Orderic Vitalis, interpolating into the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, said Herlever's kinsmen were polling-Tories, a classical term meaning those who prepare corpses for burial. 12th century poets translating for a lay audience chose the closest word they knew. Armoniquier, pelletier, skinner, pelterer, and the slur stuck. Falaise, which really was a leather-working town with dye pits cut into the living rock below the castle, reinforced it. By the time William was a young man besieging rebel fortresses, the garrison needed only to drape a few hides over the palisade to set him shaking with rage. He was called, as a child, William the Bastard. It was not an insult, it was a description. His father, Robert I, called the Magnificent for his lavishness, and the devil by those who whispered he had poisoned his own elder brother Richard III to seize the duchy, had been duke since 1027 and already lived in the shadow of that rumour. At Christmas 1034, Robert shocked his court by announcing he would go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He was young, vigorous, and had no legitimate son. He was also, in the estimate of every chronicler, a man attempting to buy his way out of a mortal sin. Before leaving, he summoned his magnates to Caen, placed his 7-year-old bastard on his knee, and extracted their oaths. Then he rode east. He reached Jerusalem, turned west, and died at Nicaea on July 2nd, 1035, his body carried in a litter by Saracen bearers, a famous image Norman poets would repeat for generations. He was buried in a church in Asia Minor he had never meant to see. Word took months to reach Rouen. This is biographer David Douglas's first revisionist point, and it is fundamental. What Robert left behind was not a ragged Viking warlord state one generation removed from longships. By 1035, Normandy was more Carolingian than Norse. The duchy ran on machinery inherited from Charlemagne's successors, Viscountess in the districts, a chancery in Rouen, 7 ancient Latin dioceses, a silver coinage struck in Frankish standards, a nobility that spoke Romance and bore Frankish titles. Rollo's Vikings had conquered the land in 911 and been absorbed by it. The Scandinavian layers survived in Western place names, in a few legal customs of the Cotentia, in the trade links Elizabeth van Holtz has traced to the Baltic, but the skeleton holding the body up was Frankish. This administrative skeleton is the reason Normandy did not simply disintegrate when an 8-year-old boy inherited it. The apparatus kept running while the men at the top tore one another apart. And tear one another apart they did. Alan of Brittany, Robert's chosen guardian, was dead by October 1040, reportedly poisoned. Gilbert of Briona, who replaced him, was murdered within months, possibly at the instigation of the very man imposed as his successor. Churchill, the boy's tutor, was killed. And in the single most vivid scene of William's childhood, the one image that captures everything you need to know about what this upbringing did to a boy's soul, Osbjorn the steward had his throat cut in the bedchamber while young William slept a few feet away. The next Duke of Normandy woke to find his seneschal's blood pooling on the floor. His uncle Walter, Herleva's brother, slept in his chamber with a sword. More than one, Sordoric tells us. Walter carried the boy out of the castle at night and hid him in the cottages of the poor. Think about that. The legitimate ruler of one of Europe's richest duchies, concealed in a peasant's loft, listening to his uncle breathe in the dark. No medieval prince came to adulthood with a more acute understanding of how vulnerable power actually was. Every instinct he would later display as king. The pathological need to survey and count, the refusal to delegate, the cold willingness to destroy whole regions to make an example, was forged in that bedchamber where Osbjorn died. Chapter 2. Night Ride to Falaise. The Guardians died. The apparatus held. William grew. Around 1042 or 1043, when he was about 15, King Henry I of France, his nominal overlord, and Robert's old protege, knighted him. From that moment the bastard began to act in his own name. He would need to, because the lords of Western Normandy, the Cotentin and the Bessin, where Viking memory ran deepest and ducal authority ran weakest, had decided it was time to be rid of him. In the autumn of 1046, William was hunting near Valognes, deep in Cotentin marsh country. A conspiracy had formed around Guy of Burgundy, his cousin, a legitimate grandson of Richard II who considered his own claim to Normandy superior to a bastard's. That night, a jester named Golet. The story is Wace's, poetic but grounded in older fact, burst into William's chamber and warned him the lords were arming to kill him in his sleep. William pulled on clothes, seized the best horse, and rode out alone into the dark. What followed was the longest night of his life, and one of the most dramatic rides in medieval history. Some 150 kilometers from Valognes to Falaise, through the tidal fords at the base of the Cotentin, through Montebourg and Turqueville, across the flats of the Veille at low water, skirting Bayeux, arriving at dawn at Rise, where a loyal lord named Hubert gave him a fresh horse and sent his own 3 sons as guides. Hubert stood on his own bridge and deliberately misdirected William's pursuers. By the end of the next day, the Duke was safe behind the walls of Falaise, the cliff town where his mother had borne him. From there, he rode to Poissy and threw himself on the mercy of King Henry. The king came. In early 1047, on the rolling chalk plains southeast of Caen, at a place called Valais Dunes, the royal host and the loyal Normans of Upper Normandy met the Western rebels. The critical moment came when Ralph Tesson, who had sworn an oath to join the rebels, rode to William, struck him a deliberately harmless blow with a glove to discharge his oath, and changed sides. The rebel line broke. Men drowned in the Orne trying to flee. Guy of Burgundy escaped to his castle at Brionne. William besieged him there for 3 years until he gave up and left Normandy forever. Valais Dunes did not make William Duke. He had been that for 12 years. It made him ruler. Within months, at a council in Caen in October 1047, he harnessed the moral authority of the church by proclaiming the truce of God throughout the duchy. No private warfare from Wednesday evening to Monday morning on pain of excommunication. The Duke and the King were exempted. Their violence was public peace. In a single stroke, William had turned the reforming church into an enforcement arm of ducal authority. He would play that instrument the rest of his life. Chapter 3. Hides for the Tanner. Between 1047 and 1060, William fought almost continuously. He fought Geoffrey Martel of Anjou, the Hammer, who had seized Maine and was clawing northward. He fought his own uncle, William of Arques, besieging him out of his great castle near Dieppe. He fought Henry I of France, who by 1053 had grown frightened of the monster he had helped create, and who twice invaded Normandy with Angevin allies. And in 1051 or 1052, at the fortress of Alençon on the southern frontier, he did the thing that every medieval chronicler reports and no modern biographer can explain away. The garrison of an outlying stronghold, trying to unnerve the young duke, hung animal hides from the palisade and beat them with their fists, chanting the old taunt, "Pelem, pelem parator, hides, hides for the tanner." It was a calculated assault on the wound that never healed. William took the outpost. He had 32 of the garrison mutilated, hands and feet cut off, the 128 severed extremities catapulted over the walls of the main fortress of Alençon. The main fortress surrendered on sight. The neighboring stronghold of Domfront surrendered on hearing the news. William of Poitiers, the chaplain who would follow William to England and write his biography as a panegyric, reported the mutilation without embarrassment, not as a lapse, but as a demonstration. This was how a bastard silenced men who mocked his mother. By terror, calibrated in public. It is the darkest scene in Norman history. And it is also the Rosetta Stone of William's character. The boy who had slept beside Osborne's blood had learned that violence, applied without hesitation or mercy, was the only language everyone understood. The Angevin Wars turned in his favour at Mortimer in February 1054. when the eastern prong of a royal invasion was surprised at dawn in the marshy Pays de Bray and annihilated. Walter Giffard and William de Warenne and the young Roger of Mortimer crushed the French while they were still pillaging and raping among burning farms. Guy of Ponthieu was taken prisoner. Count Odo, the king's brother, barely escaped. A Norman herald rode to a hilltop across the Seine and shouted the news to Henry I's camp, and Henry turned for home. 3 years later, at a tidal ford on the Dives near Varaville, William trapped a second royal army as the tide came in and split it in half. A wooden bridge collapsed under panicking horsemen. Henry watched from a hill and rode away. Varaville was the last invasion of Normandy in William's lifetime. Then came 1060, the providential year. Henry I of France died in August. Geoffrey Martel of Anjou died in November. In a single season, both of William's great adversaries vanished, leaving a boy king, Philip I, under the regency of William's father-in-law, Baldwin V of Flanders, and a disputed succession in Anjou. Within 3 years, William had absorbed the county of Maine. He now ruled, in effect, from the Somme to the Loire. He was 35 years old and had become the most formidable warlord in Latin Christendom. Chapter 5. The Wife, the Abbot, the Stone. He had also by then married Matilda. She was the daughter of Baldwin V of Flanders and Adela of France, a granddaughter of the late French king, a woman of genuinely royal blood which her bastard husband did not possess. Pope Leo IX forbade the match at the Council of Reims in October 1049, citing the web of cousinage that connected them through their common descent from Rollo. The match went ahead anyway, sometime around 1051 or 1052, at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Eu. The legend that William dragged Matilda through the streets of Bruges by her braids to change her mind is later romance. What is clear from the charters is that they became, by every available measure, a partnership without parallel in the medieval royal record. She was small, not the 4'2" dwarf queen of Victorian popular lore, a figure derived from a 19th century misreading, but about 5 feet exactly, as the 1959 examination of her bones at La Trinité established. He was tall for his age. The single surviving fragment of his skeleton, a femur rescued from the Huguenot desecration of 1562 and measured repeatedly since, suggests he stood about 5'10". Contemporary sources are unanimous on one striking point. In an age when royal philandering was default, William appears to have been faithful to her. No known mistresses, no known bastards. The son of Robert the Magnificent, who had sired William on a burgher's daughter and been dead before his boy turned 8, became the one Norman duke who kept his vows. Matilda bore him at least 9 children, including the future William II, the future Henry I, a daughter who would mother King Stephen, and Robert, called Curthose for his short legs, who would become his father's torment. She witnessed 100 of his charters. She served as regent of Normandy 6 separate times. When William crossed to England in 1066, his flagship, the Mora, lion-proud, built at Barfleur, was a personal gift. As papal penance for the irregular marriage, the couple founded 2 abbeys at Caen. Saint-Étienne the Abbaye aux Hommes would become William's burial place. La Trinité the Abbaye aux Dames would become Matilda's. Both still stand, masterpieces of the Romanesque, their pale Caen limestone catching the Normandy light. To run Saint-Étienne, William summoned the most brilliant churchman north of the Alps, Lanfranc of Pavia, a lawyer turned monk who had arrived at the new monastery of Bec in 1042 and made it the premier school in northern Europe. Lanfranc had once opposed William's marriage on canonical grounds, and the Duke had exiled him and ravaged Bec's lands in retaliation. The famous reconciliation has Lanfranc riding out on a lame horse, meeting the furious William on the road, and deflecting him with a joke. "I obey as fast as this lame horse allows. Give me a better one and I'll leave faster." William laughed and reconciled. It was the beginning of the most important relationship of his life outside Matilda. Lanfranc would go to Rome and negotiate the papal dispensation. Lanfranc would become abbot of Saint-Étienne in 1063. Lanfranc would become, in 1070, Archbishop of Canterbury. For the rest of William's reign, he would be the intellectual architect of the Conqueror's ecclesiastical order. Chapter 6. The Oath on the Bones. By 1065, William's claim to England was, in Norman tellings at least, more than 2 decades old and reinforced by recent oath. The Anglo-Norman relationship stretched back to 1002, when the hapless King Athelred married Emma of Normandy, Rollo's great-granddaughter, to buy off Norman harbours from Viking raiders. Her sons Edward the Confessor and Alfred Aetheling grew up in Rouen during the Danish conquest. Edward spent nearly a quarter century in exile there, so thoroughly Normanized that when he returned to the English throne in 1042, he brought a train of Norman clerics and nobles with him. He had married Edith of Wessex, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin, in 1045. They had no children. He may have had no interest in having any. In the autumn of 1051, Edward quarreled violently with the Godwin family and exiled them. During that brief window, as William of Poitiers and William of Jumièges tell it, Edward designated William his heir. The Norman Archbishop Robert of Jumièges, travelling to Rome for his pallium, is the plausible conduit. No English source confirms the designation. Edward himself, after reconciling with the Godwins a year later, sent agents to Hungary to bring back Edward the Exile as a rival candidate. He was probably playing several heirs against each other, but Norman propaganda, post-1066, sharpened the ambiguity into a promise. The second piece of the claim was the oath. Around 1064 or 1065, Harold Godwinson, by then the most powerful man in England after Edward, crossed the Channel for reasons no one has ever fully explained. He may have been seeking the release of his brother Wulfnoth and nephew Håkon, who had been Norman hostages since 1052. He may have been blown off course. He was wrecked on the coast of Ponthia, captured by Count Guy, rescued by William, who took him on a military expedition against the Bretons near Mont Saint-Michel. During that campaign, the Bayeux Tapestry shows it vividly. Harold pulled Norman soldiers out of quicksand with his own hands and was ceremonially knighted by William. Then he swore the oath. The tapestry shows him standing between 2 reliquaries, hands outstretched, under the caption HEC Harold Sacramentum Fecit Willem Duchy. The sources disagree on the location, Bonneville, Bayeux, Rouen, but agree on the substance. Harold swore to support William's succession. A later tradition, recorded by Wace, said William had concealed the relics under a cloth, so Harold did not know he was swearing on bones. Whether that is true or embellishment, the oath was the pivot on which William's entire invasion would turn. When Harold broke it, William could present himself to the Pope not as an invader but as an aggrieved lord pursuing a perjurer. Edward died in the small hours of January 5th, 1066, in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey. On his deathbed, according to the Vita Adwadi, he commended his widow and kingdom to Harold's protection, words that could be read as designation or as request for regency, or as anything Harold's allies wanted them to mean. The Witan met the next morning and elected Harold. He was crowned January 6, 1066 at Westminster Abbey, not by the canonically dubious Archbishop Stigand as the Bayeux Tapestry claims in a piece of Norman propaganda, but by Ealdred of York as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and modern scholarship agree. He was crowned January 6th, 1066, at Westminster Abbey, not by the canonically dubious Archbishop Stigand as the Bayeux Tapestry claims in a piece of Norman propaganda, but by Ealdred of York. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and modern scholarship agree, in late April, Halley's comet appeared over England. Heilmer of Malmesbury, the aged monk who had seen it 76 years earlier, is said to have wept and cried, "You've come, have you? You've come, you source of tears to many mothers." Chapter 4. The Wind That Turned. William was in Rouen when the news of Harold's coronation reached him. William of Poitiers, who knew him personally, says he sat silent for a long time, fastening and unfastening his cloak. Then he began to plan an invasion. The scale of what he attempted is almost impossible to overstate. No significant cross-channel invasion had succeeded since the Romans. The logistics were ruinous. Men, horses, armor, food, fodder, wine, prefabricated timbers for forts on the far shore. He had no royal treasury to draw on. He had Normans whose feudal service did not extend overseas, and who had to be persuaded. At the Council of Lillebonne that spring, his barons balked. William Fitzhugh cajoled them into pledging specific ship and night quotas, which were written down in what survives as the ship list. The total came to about 776 vessels promised, though the fleet that actually sailed was probably smaller, something like 500 to 700 purpose-built ships carrying between 7 and 10,000 men. He went wider. He sent envoys to Rome. Archdeacon Gilbert of Lisieux, backed by the formidable Archdeacon Hildebrand Flug, presented Harold as a perjurer and extracted from Pope Alexander II a consecrated papal banner and, by some accounts, a ring containing a hair of St. Peter. It was the first time a papal vexillum had been granted for a war of conquest, a transformative precedent the Church would regret within a generation. When the banners began flying over the Crusades, he recruited beyond Normandy Bretons under Alan Fergant, Flemings through Matilda's connections, French from Picardy and Ile-de-France, Count Eustace II of Boulogne, mercenaries from as far as southern Italy. The army sat at the mouth of the river Dives through August and into September, waiting for a southerly wind. None came. Around September 12th, William moved the fleet east along the coast to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, losing ships to a storm. William of Poitiers admits the Duke buried the drowned in secret so as not to break morale. At St. Valery, the relics of the saint were paraded around the camp. The wind refused to shift. Meanwhile, on the other side of the North Sea, a third claimant arrived, Harald Hardrada of Norway, the most fearsome warrior of the age, who had commanded the Varangian Guard in Constantinople and fought from Sicily to Kiev, landed in the Tyne on about September 8, 1066, with some 300 ships. He was joined by Harold's exiled brother Tostig. On September 20th, they destroyed the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford, just outside York. York submitted. Harold Godwinson, watching the channel for William, received the news and did something no medieval king was supposed to do. He moved. His housecarls marched 185 miles in roughly 4 days, picking up furdmen as they went, and on September 25th at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York, they caught the Norwegians unprepared, many without mail on a hot day. A single berserker held the bridge until a Saxon speared him from below through the planks in a swill tub. After a day of brutal fighting, Hardrada was dead with an arrow through the throat. Tostig was dead, and the Norwegian invasion was annihilated. Of 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Orderic Vitalis, visiting decades later, reported the battlefield was still recognizable by the piles of bones. It is the battle traditionally marked as the end of the Viking Age. 2 days later, at St. Valery, The wind turned. William crossed on the night of September 27th, 28, and landed at Pevensey on September 28th, 1066. He stumbled as he stepped ashore. Reputedly, he turned the bad omen by gripping a handful of English earth and declaring he had already seized the kingdom. Within days, he moved the army to Hastings, erected a prefabricated fort whose timbers had come across the channel, and he began systematically burning Sussex villages, including Harold's own estates. It was deliberate provocation. He wanted Harold to come south fast, without the northern earlers, without time to regroup. Harold did exactly that. From York to the hoary apple tree at Calbeck Hill, the total forced march ran some 260 miles in about 2 weeks. Chapter 5. Dawn to dusk on Senlac Ridge. The battle that began at 9 in the morning of October 14th, 1066, on the ridge where Battle Abbey now stands, lasted roughly 9 hours. Extraordinarily long for a medieval engagement and the clearest possible evidence of how evenly matched the armies were. It is the most studied battle of the Middle Ages, and it still resists certainty. The sources contradict one another. The Bayeux Tapestry shows things that did not happen and omits things that did. What follows is the best reconstruction of what the weight of scholarship supports. The English held the ridge, perhaps 7,000 strong, housecarls with two-handed Danish axes in the front ranks, the third behind. The shield wall stretched half a mile, 5 to 7 deep, flanks anchored on forest and marsh. Gurth and Leofwine, Harold's brothers, stood in the line. Edith Swanneck, his handfast wife, was somewhere in the rear. William deployed in 3 waves: archers, infantry, heavy cavalry. The mounted knights, his great innovation. Bretons on the left under Alan Fergant, Normans in the centre under the Duke himself, papal banner flying, French and Flemings on the right under Eustace of Boulogne. A Norman jongleur named Taillefer rode out juggling a sword, sang a stanza of Roland, charged alone, killed an English soldier, and was cut down. The first Norman attacks broke on the shield wall. Arrows flew too high or stuck harmlessly in English shields. Then the Breton left wing broke and fled. A portion of the English right pursued them down the hill. In the confusion, a rumour spread that William was dead. It was the crisis of the battle. William lifted his helmet. The Bayeux Tapestry freezes the moment, and cried, according to William of Poitiers, "Look at me. I am still alive, and with God's help I will be the victor." The Norman knights wheeled and annihilated the pursuing English on a small hillock. Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother the bishop, wielded a mace so as not to shed blood, he said, a theological nicety the tapestry commemorates. And then twice in the afternoon, the Normans did something that transformed the battle. They feigned flight. Older historians doubted it, thinking it post-hoc glamorizing of genuine routes. But the tactic is documented in other Norman battles from Arques to Messina, and the current consensus accepts it. Small groups of English pursued. Norman cavalry wheeled on them and cut them down. Gurth and Leofwine probably died in one of these pursuits. The shield wall thinned. Late in the day, in the last light, the Normans broke through. What happened to Harold is the most contested question in English medieval history, and it is more or less unanswerable. The earliest account, the Carmen de Hastingae Proelio, attributed to Guy of Amiens, written within months of the battle, mentions no arrow. It describes William and 3 knights breaking through and hacking the king apart. Breast, head, belly, thigh. The last almost certainly a euphemism. William of Poitiers is vague. William of Jumièges mentions no arrow. The first arrow reference appears a decade or two later. The Bayeux tapestry shows two figures under the caption Hic Harold Rex Interfectus Est, and the 19th century restorations have muddied the iconography beyond reliable reading. The consensus today is both and. Harold was probably hit in the face or head by an arrow from the Norman high-angle barrage, then cut down by a squad of mounted knights as the wall fell. The arrow in the eye is legend, imposed on the tapestry by chroniclers who liked the theology, oath-breakers blinded by divine justice. But it is not certainly there. His body could not be identified except, by tradition, by Edith Swanneck, who knew marks on it that no one else did. William buried him under a cairn on the shore. Later he was moved to Waltham Abbey, which Harold had founded. Night fell. A last pocket of housecarls made a stand at a ravine called the Moll Foss, killing many pursuing Normans before being destroyed. Perhaps 2,000 Normans and 4,000 English lay on the ridge. With them lay the entire Anglo-Saxon ruling class. The Old England had been decapitated in a single afternoon. Chapter 7. The Trembling King. William did not march on London. He moved, with methodical cruelty, in a wide arc. Romney punished, Dover taken and fortified, Canterbury plundered, Southwark burned, Winchester and its royal treasury surrendered by the Dowager Queen, Tynes crossed at Wallingford with Stigand submitted, and finally Berkhamsted, where the Wheatons reluctantly chosen boy King Edgar Atheling, about 14 years old, came out with the archbishops and the northern earls and gave up. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles monk is unsparing. They gave hostages and swore oaths to him, and he promised them that he would be a kind lord to them. It was very imprudent that it was not done earlier, as God would not better it for our sins. On Christmas Day 1066, at Westminster Abbey, William was crowned King of England. He had chosen the date deliberately. It was the date on which Charlemagne had been crowned emperor in 800. Ealdred of York performed the consecration in English. Geoffrey of Coutances read the rite in French for the Normans. The congregation shouted the ceremonial acclamation, Vivat, in 2 languages. The Norman guards outside the abbey, hearing the roar, mistook it for a riot and did what Normans did when they heard riots. They set fire to the surrounding houses. The congregation stampeded out through smoke. Looters, some English, some Norman, seized the moment. Only the bishops and monks remained at the altar. Orderic's detail is devastating. Only just managed to complete the consecration rite over the king, who was trembling violently. It is the single moment in William's recorded life in which his self-command fails him. The rest of the day is a blur. He went to Barking and within weeks ordered the first stones of the Tower of London. He did not trust his capital. Chapter 8. The Harrowing and the Book. The first years of his reign were a succession of revolts and counter-revolts that collectively shattered the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Exeter rose in 1068. He besieged it for 18 days, mined the gate, and took it on generous terms. Edwin and Morcar rebelled and submitted. Erode the Wake held the Isle of Ely against him until 1071. When the monks of Ely betrayed the safe paths through the fens, Edgar Atheling fled to Scotland and back, and eventually made his peace. But the rebellion that defined William's reign began on January 28th, 1069, when the newly appointed Norman Earl of Northumbria, Robert de Comines, was slaughtered in Durham with some 500 men. The North rose. A Danish fleet arrived to support it. Norman garrisons in York were massacred. William bought off the Danes, spent Christmas 1069 in York ruling from the remains of the castle, and then did the thing that has stained his name ever since. The harrying of the North was a deliberate scorched earth campaign across Yorkshire, Durham, and the neighbouring shires through the winter of 1069-70. Crops were burned, livestock killed, ploughs destroyed, food stores fired, villages razed. The truce of God was violated as a matter of policy. Famine was the intended weapon. Ordoric Vitalis, writing 50 years later, put the death toll at 100,000, certainly exaggerated, but the figure captures the scale as contemporaries experienced it. Simeon of Durham wrote that corpses rotted in houses and roads because no one was alive to bury them. The Domesday Survey 17 years later would record vast swathes of the north as Woster, waste. William Capella has called it genocide. Mark Hager has called it brutal but conventional medieval practice. The debate is alive. What is not in dispute is that tens of thousands died, that the demographic damage to northern England lasted generations, and that William ordered it with his eyes open. Orderic, half English by birth, found it unforgivable. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. It was the one act he could not praise, and he left on William's deathbed lips a confession, almost certainly literary invention, but revealing, in which the old king accuses himself directly. I persecuted the native inhabitants of England beyond all reason. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the county of York, perished through me by famine and sword. I am stained with the rivers of blood that I have shed. Whether or not William felt that in 1087 the north he had made was silent, and into that silence he inserted the machinery of a new state. He kept the Anglo-Saxon shires and hundreds, the finest local administration in Europe, and replaced their sheriffs with Normans. He kept the Anglo-Saxon writ and the Anglo-Saxon coinage. He kept the Anglo-Saxon law and added Norman forest law on top of it, including the creation around 1079 of the New Forest, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claimed, with some exaggeration, evicted 36 parishes. He made castles the instrument of his rule. More than 500 built under him and his sons, the Motte and Bailey timber forts rebuilt in stone as Caen limestone was shipped across the Channel and stacked up as the White Tower in London, the great keeps at Rochester and Colchester and Durham. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle wrote bitterly, "Castles he let men build, and miserably swink the poor." He replaced the old aristocracy. By 1086, only about 5% of English land was held by men of English ancestry. Some 200 Norman and other continental tenants-in-chief had replaced thousands of Anglo-Saxon Thegans. He introduced, or rather accelerated, since the scholarship of Susan Reynolds and others has shown the picture as messier than old feudal revolution accounts suggested, a harder, more systematic form of military tenure, knight service quotas fixed to specific estates, with tenants-in-chief sub-infeudating under them. And then, 10 days after Christmas 1085, at a great council in Gloucester, he commissioned the most extraordinary administrative act of the Middle Ages. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's monk, who hated him, could not conceal his astonishment. So very narrowly he had it surveyed, that there was no single hide, nor one virgate of land, nor even one ox, nor one cow, nor one swine, that was not set down in his writ. Domesday Book. Commissioners were dispatched to every shire. Juries of 12 men per 100 gave sworn testimony. 13,418 settlements surveyed. The work was largely done in under a year. The English called it Domesday, Doomsday, because its verdict, like the Last Judgment, could not be appealed. It survives in the National Archives and was consulted as a live legal document into the 20th century. 7 months after the Gloucester Commission, on Lammas Day, August 1st, 1086, William summoned every significant landholder in England, tenants-in-chief and their under-tenants, perhaps 1,000 men or more, to Old Sarum near Salisbury. There, in what the Anglo-Saxon chronicle calls the Salisbury Gemot, every man swore direct fealty to William, bypassing his immediate lord. It was a revolutionary principle. On the continent, a vassal's first loyalty was to his own lord. My vassal's vassal is not my vassal was the rule. In England, by the Salisbury Oath, every landholder owed the king first. This single act, more than any other, is why the English monarchy would become the strongest centralized state in medieval Europe, and why, paradoxically, it would also be the monarchy that Parliament and Magna Carta would eventually have the strongest single target to push against. Chapter 9. The family that destroyed itself. While he built the state, his family came apart. His eldest son Robert, nicknamed Curthose for his short legs, a nickname his father invented, as if to say you will never be the warrior I am, had been promised Normandy as a boy, but his father never gave him any real authority. And by the late 1070s, Robert was a furious man in his 20s with nothing to do. In 1077 or 1078, at Legal, his younger brothers William, Rufus and Henry, teenagers playing the cruel games teenagers play, emptied a chamber pot from a balcony onto Robert's head. Robert exploded. Their father intervened to stop Robert beating his brothers, but refused to punish them. That night, Robert tried to seize the castle at Rouen. He failed and fled to Flanders and then to a castle Philip I of France put at his disposal on the Norman border. There, at Gerberoy in January 1079, Robert and his 50-year-old father fought in single combat. William was unhorsed and wounded in the hand by his own son's lance. Rufus, fighting alongside his father, was also wounded. Robert, recognizing the voice coming from beneath the helmet, lowered his weapon and let his father ride away. Matilda, who had been sending Robert money secretly against her husband's orders, engineered a reconciliation at Easter 1080. It held until she died. She died on November 2nd, 1083, at Caen, and was buried at La Trinité. The 11th century black ledger stone with its Latin epitaph survives. William's grief shocked contemporaries. He showed many days of the deepest mourning, Orderic wrote, how much he missed the love of her whom he had lost. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle dates the change in his character. The deepening avarice, the erratic cruelty, the estrangement from Robert to her death. In 1082 he had arrested his own half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, Earl of Kent, the richest tenant-in-chief in England. The man who had commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry and fought with a mace at Hastings, was planning an expedition to Italy, possibly to buy the papacy during the investiture controversy. William had him arrested on the Isle of Wight and imprisoned at Rouen. I do not condemn a cleric or bishop, he said, but an earl. Odo sat in prison for 5 years. Chapter 9. 7 feet of earth. The end came in the summer of 1087. William had grown immensely fat. Malmesbury describes him as of extraordinary corpulence, his belly deforming his royal person. Philip I of France, whose minority William had once protected, mocked him cruelly. The King of England, Philip said, was lying in at Rouen like a woman after her delivery. William, enraged, threatened to celebrate his churching in Paris with 10,000 candles. That is, 10,000 torches. In late July, he invaded the French Vexin and burned the town of Mantes, including its churches. 2 hermits were burned alive in the flames, riding through the smoldering ruins. Possibly on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, his horse either stumbled in hot ashes or reared. The enormous king was thrown hard against the iron pommel of his saddle. Malmesbury says his stomach ruptured. Orderic says he collapsed from heat and exhaustion. A modern diagnosis might propose internal hemorrhage or peritonitis. He was carried to Rouen. The noise and heat of the city were unbearable. They moved him to the priory of Saint Gervais on a hill outside the walls. He lingered there for 5 weeks. What happened in that room is, in Orderic's telling, the greatest deathbed scene in medieval literature. Much of it is certainly invention. Some of it is plausibly authentic. William divided his inheritance, Normandy to Robert Curthose, unwillingly but by feudal right. England to William Rufus, dispatched to Lanfranc with a letter before the old king was even dead. £5,000 of silver and no land to Henry, who was told to learn from his brother's folly and who, within 20 years, would have everything. He released Odo reluctantly, at Robert of Mortaine's insistence. He distributed treasure to churches and the poor so that what I amassed through evil deeds may be assigned to the holy uses of good men. He confessed, or Orderic confessed on his behalf, his cruelties in the north. Early on the morning of September 9th, 1087, the great bell of Rouen Cathedral began to toll for prime. He asked what it was. He was told. He commended his soul to the Virgin. He died. What followed was the most undignified royal funeral in European history. His attendants, the moment they were sure he was dead, stripped the body and fled to secure their own property. The corpse of the Conqueror lay naked on the floor of the priory for hours. A common knight named Herluin, at his own expense, washed it and arranged transport by boat down the Seine and overland to Caen, a journey of some 70 miles in summer heat. Decomposition accelerated. As the cortege approached Saint-Étienne, a fire broke out in Caen, a city William's own construction had largely built, and most of the mourners ran to fight it. Only the monks completed the procession. During the funeral, as Bishop Gislebert of Evreux delivered the eulogy, a local knight named Asselin Fitzarthur stepped forward in what was effectively a clameur de haro, the ancient Norman legal cry, and interrupted the service. The land on which Saint-Étienne stood, he said, had been seized from his father. He forbade in God's name that this robber be buried in soil that was rightfully his. The claim was investigated on the spot, found true, and Asselin paid 60 shillings of silver to allow the burial to continue. Prince Henry promised him £100 more. Then the stone sarcophagus turned out to be too short. When the monks forced the swollen body into it, the abdomen burst and an intolerable stench, Orderic's phrase, filled Saint-Étienne. Incense and censers could not mask it. The rites were hurriedly concluded. 500 years later, in 1562, Huguenots broke open the tomb and scattered his bones across Caen. A single left femur was recovered and reinterred. The femur was desecrated again during the French Revolution in 1793. What survived, a fragment of thigh bone, was reburied under the current marble slab in 1987, on the 900th anniversary of his death. From it, scholars have calculated that he stood about 5'10", tall for his age, a warrior's frame, deformed in its last years by appetite and sorrow. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles monk who had lived at his court delivered the most balanced contemporary verdict. William was a very wise man and very rich, more splendid and powerful than any of his predecessors. He was mild to the good men that loved God, and beyond all measure severe to the men that gainsaid his will. He loved the tall deer as if he were their father. The poor shuddered at its forest laws. The good peace he made was such that a man of any account might go over his kingdom unhurt with his bosom full of gold. And then the final, unsparing line, the one every English schoolchild was once taught. He who was earlier a powerful king and lord of many a land, he had nothing of any land but a 7-foot measure, and he who was at times clothed with gold and with jewels, he lay then covered over with earth. Chapter 10. The country he made. He is the reason you speak the language you speak. About 30% of modern English vocabulary descends from Norman French, beef and pork and mutton for what the Anglo-Saxon cow and pig and sheep became on Norman tables. Court and justice and parliament for the institutions he and his sons built. The diglossia he imposed, French for the aristocracy, English for the commons, Latin for the church, compressed Old English into Middle English within a century. Law French, the technical language of courtroom pleading, did not finally leave English courts until 1731. He did not intend any of this. He intended to conquer, and the language was collateral consequence. The diglossia he imposed, French for the aristocracy, English for the commons, Latin for the church, compressed Old English into Middle English within a century. Law French, the technical language of courtroom pleading, did not finally leave English courts until 1731. He did not intend any of this. He intended to conquer, and the language was collateral consequence. He is the reason the common law exists. David Douglas's central argument was that William did not destroy Anglo-Saxon institutions, he centralized and hardened them. The shire, the hundred, the sheriff, the writ, all survived the conquest, but with Norman administrative rigor imposed on top. From that fusion, under Henry II, a century later, came the royal writs, the itinerant justices, the jury, the exchequer, the scaffolding of what the world now calls common law. More than 600 million people live under legal systems that descend, at least in part, from what William did not think to abolish. The shire, the hundred, the sheriff, the writ, all survived the conquest, but with Norman administrative rigor imposed on top. From that fusion, under Henry II, a century later, came the royal writs, the itinerant justices, the jury, the exchequer, the scaffolding of what the world now calls common law. More than 600 million people live under legal systems that descend, at least in part, from what William did not think to abolish. He is the reason Parliament exists. Not directly. The model Parliament of 1295 is 2 centuries downstream, but through the mechanism the Witan evolved into. The great councils of tenants-in-chief, summoned to ratify royal will, and above all through the principle of the Salisbury Oath. Direct loyalty to the crown overriding feudal mediation, the single institutional innovation that gave the English state more reach than any other in medieval Europe, and therefore also gave its subjects the single strongest target against which to push back. The barons at Runnymede in 1215 were able to force Magna Carta precisely because William had built a crown that could be forced. The paradox runs through the whole subsequent history. A kingdom made too strong to be meddled with, by a king whose strength created the standing against which later Englishmen would define their liberties. He is the reason England is covered in castles, 500 of them under his reign alone. The White Tower, begun around 1078, still stands at the heart of London, its pale Caen limestone, the same stone that built Saint-Étienne and La Trinité, catching the winter sun. He is the reason 1066 is the date every English schoolchild knows. The Spanish Armada failed in 1588. The French never launched. Operation Sea Lion was cancelled in 1940. 1066 is, by common convention, the last successful invasion of England, though a minority of historians would argue that William of Orange's well-armed landing at Brixham in 1688 counts as another. The point survives the quibble. For nearly 1,000 years, No hostile army has successfully taken London by the sword. What he is not the reason for is English DNA. The Oxford-led Genetic Atlas Studies of 2015, a more recent work on rural conquest-era cemeteries, find almost no distinctive Norman genetic signature in the modern British population. He conquered an aristocracy, not a people. The English remained English, in their blood, in their farms, in the names of their villages, in the persistent folk memory of the Norman yoke that 17th century levelers invoked against the Stuarts and that migrated across the Atlantic into American constitutional rhetoric. Robin Hood, in the long ballad tradition, is an Englishman resisting Normans. The conquered have the last word in the mythology, as the conquered often do. Chapter 11. The man who was never at peace. What kind of man was he? The paradoxes hold up under examination precisely because they are not really paradoxes. They are the coherent expression of a single formation. The boy who had hidden in peasant cottages while his guardians were murdered became a ruler whose first instinct always was to survey, to count, to record, to secure. Domesday Book is a psychological document as well as a fiscal one, the compulsion of a man who never wanted to be surprised again. The bastard whose mother's origins had been mocked at Alençon became a husband of conspicuous, perhaps unique, marital fidelity. His devotion to Matilda was the most disciplined refusal in his life, a pointed anti-repetition of his father. The warlord who could obliterate Yorkshire in a winter could also ride slowly around a rebel town and offer generous terms if it opened its gates. He was a man of daily mass and exploding rage. He laughed at Lanfranc's jokes and cut the hands off 32 men who had mocked his mother. He built reforming cathedrals and exported famine. He loved the tall deer as if he were their father, and he was, by every measure, the most violent great king of his century. He was also, and this is what makes him finally remarkable rather than merely medieval, a conscious architect. He knew what he was doing. The choice of Christmas Day for his coronation, echoing Charlemagne. The preservation of Anglo-Saxon local administration while replacing its personnel wholesale. The Salisbury Oath is an act of constitutional imagination. The commissioning of Domesday itself, a document unlike anything in Europe. These were the deliberate acts of a man who had spent his life thinking about how fragile power actually is, and who was determined, having seized it, to make it impossible to remove. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. His crown, fused from Anglo-Saxon material and Norman will, lasted. Its institutions lasted. Its language lasted. 1,000 years after he bled into the dust at Mantes and burst from his coffin at Caen, every constitutional monarchy descended from Westminster, every court that cites Magna Carta or opens a trial with words half of which are from Norman French, every parliament whose writ runs back to a great council of tenants-in-chief is walking on ground that William laid. He would not have understood the tribute. He would have understood the footprint. He had seen, as a boy, exactly what happens to a prince whose men do not fear him. He had spent 60 years making sure that would not be his story. What he made instead, unintentionally, as great men so often do, was ours.